In this lesson, we will learn about SASS. SASS is a CSS extension language. I will explain what that means in just a moment, but first I must point out that SASS is not an official part of CSS. This means that you do not need to learn SASS. So if at any point during this lesson you decide that SASS is not for you, you don't like it, you don't want to deal with it, you don't want to learn about it, that's absolutely okay. However, I feel that you would be doing yourself a disservice if you didn't at least stick around and watch this lesson to see what all the fuss is about. So throughout this course, you've been learning about CSS. And I would assume that at some point throughout the course, you've had the following thought in the back of your mind. CSS, I love you because you let me style content however I want. But CSS, I also hate you. Why do you make me repeat myself so often? Why can't you remember the color values that I want to use? Why can't you remember anything? Why don't you, as a computer language, offer me, the coder, tools to stay flexible and dynamic? Well, you're not alone. We've all had that thought in the back of our mind. And SASS is the result of some of the web's brightest minds coming together and creating an extension language for CSS that resolves all of those issues and limitations with CSS that I was just complaining about. So the question becomes, well, what exactly is SASS? What is an extension language? To answer those questions, let's look at a few drawings. We, as web developers and designers, write CSS code because it's our way of adding style to pages and applications. Now, we don't write CSS code because it's our favorite language in the world. We write CSS code to make the web browser happy, even at the expense of our own happiness. Because as we've pointed out, CSS from a coding perspective has its own set of limitations or weaknesses or common points of frustration. Now, to circumvent those limitations, we could try to invent our own style sheet language or our own syntax, but that wouldn't change the fact that web browsers still need traditional CSS code. So if we tried to invent our own syntax, we would be happy because coding would be more enjoyable, but the web browser would just sit in the corner with a sad look on its face, unable to add any style to the page. So this is where SASS comes into play. The brilliant minds behind SASS invented their own style sheet syntax. Now, if we use this new syntax and try to pass it directly into the web browser won't understand it, and none of the content will be styled. So again, we will be happy because the code is more enjoyable to write, but the browser will still be sad. But the great minds behind SASS did not stop there. They invented a syntax, and then they created a compiler that takes the SASS code, the SASS syntax, and converts it into regular CSS that can be passed on to the web browser. So the web browser's happy, and so are we because the code is much more enjoyable to write. So our goal for this lesson is to familiarize ourselves with SASS syntax and get a feel for the extension language's basic features. Now, in order for you to follow along during the lesson or directly after the lesson, you'll need to get your hands on the middleman, the SASS compiler, the tool that takes SASS syntax and magically converts it into regular CSS. Now, if you want fast, immediate gratification, perform a web search for SassMeister or CodePen. These are web applications, and you can write SASS code directly in the browser, and then it will spit back the traditional CSS code for you. If you want a bit more of a robust solution, and you want to install the SASS compiler on your local computer, I suggest you perform a web search for Koala SASS or Scout SASS. So with the logistics out of the way, let's dive right in. Here we are in the web browser. This is an example page, and it does not have any CSS styling applied to it yet. At this point, it is pure, raw HTML. So in the code for this page, we can see that just like in every other lesson in the course, we are linking to a CSS file that lives within a folder named CSS, and the file is named screen.css. So here is the folder where the HTML page lives. Here is the CSS folder. Here is the screen.css file. Now currently this file is empty. There's not an ounce of CSS code in it. Now we can see in this folder there's an additional file named screen.scss. This file extension stands for SASS CSS. So in this lesson, we will be writing Sass code within this file, and every time we save our progress, the middleman Sass compiler that is running in the background on my computer will detect the save and then take a mental snapshot of our Sass code, convert it into regular CSS, and export that output into this screen.css file. So that way, we still have a traditional CSS file we can pass along to the web browser. Okay, so here we are in the text editor. On the left side of the screen is the sassy.css file. It's currently empty. And I want to begin by showing you that Sassy CSS is completely backwards compatible with normal CSS. So we can write a bit of normal code like body, font family, Helvetica, sans serif. And if I save, we see on the right side of the screen that the normal.css file is automatically provided a copy of whatever we typed in our Sassy CSS file. So that is the middleman Sass compiler in the background doing its job. So if we head over to the web browser and refresh, we can see that the font Helvetica is being used. But that wasn't a very exciting change because that was just standard CSS. Let's try our first taste of Sass syntax. So let's imagine that we want to define a color scheme for this page. Let's imagine that we've identified this shade of orange as the primary color for our palette. So let's begin by applying that orange color to all links on the page. So if we weren't using Sass, we would simply say A to select the anchor elements, color, and then paste in the hexadecimal color code. Now you know we're going to need that color value again somewhere else in our style sheet, and there's no sense in trying to search for it or memorize it. So instead I'm going to delete the reference to the color there, and at the very top of the style sheet I'm going to use the $sign and say primary color, colon, and then paste in the hexadecimal color code. So I just created a variable. We can't create variables in normal CSS, but we can in Sass. Now for those of you that have not used a programming language in the past, a variable in this context is just a code name for this value. So now we can reference this hexadecimal color code by simply saying primary color. So in this rule for links, you can say color should use primary color. So if I save, we see that the Sass compiler converted this code into this. So if we load the web page and refresh, we can see all of our links are now orange. So the key concept here is that there's no need to repeat ourselves as coders. If we know that we are going to use a value more than once, let's define it as a variable. Before we move on, I want to point out that there's nothing special about the phrase primary color. It doesn't have any inherent meaning. I made it up. You could choose any name for your variable that you would like. So for example, instead of primary color, I could name this beautiful hue. And then in the rule for our link color, I would use that phrase again, beautiful hue. So it doesn't matter what you choose for your variable names. The whole idea is that we're only defining our values once, and then we use the variable name throughout the rest of our style sheet. So that's the first feature of Sass, the ability to create and use variables. Let's move on to the next feature, which is called nesting. In order to see nesting in action, let's give ourselves a goal. Let's imagine that we want to style this navigation in the header to look like a traditional horizontal navigation menu. So in our HTML code, we can see that the navigation menu is nothing more than a nav element with an unordered list, and then list items with a link inside each item. And this nav element lives within the header that has a class of site header. So in our CSS, we'll use a class of site header and then target the nav element. So the first thing we'll do is target the unordered list element and remove any padding or margin that it may have. Next, we want to target the list items and remove their bullets. So list style none. Let's also float the list items to the left so that they all sit on one horizontal line. Now, before we go any further, I want to point out that without SASS, this code is absolutely absurd. This is not valid CSS. You cannot nest one rule inside another rule, but we can with SASS. So nesting like this offers two primary benefits. Number one, it helps us stay organized conceptually. We know that the unordered list and list items are children or are nested within the site header nav element. We see that structure reflected in our HTML code. Why not see that structure reflected in our CSS code? And the second benefit to SASS nesting is that it saves us from a lot of unnecessary typing. So when I hit save, you see that the compiler automatically creates selectors for these different rules that make sense from a normal CSS standpoint. So I didn't need to type out site header nav for each element that we wanted to style. I only typed out site header nav once and then relied on nesting. So for example, let's target the actual link elements themselves. So A, let's make them display block. Give them a bit of padding. Let's make them use a background color of orange with a text color of white. So background color, beautiful hue, color should be white. Let's remove their text underline, text decoration none. Let's also add a bit of margin right to the list items. So when I save again, you see that the SASS compiler created this new rule. And again, I didn't have to type in site header nav. All I did was target the A element. And because this rule is nested within this parent rule, the compiler took care of the rest. Now let's view our changes in the browser. So if I refresh, we can see that the navigation menu looks a lot better. However, we see this content spilling up, and that's because we did not clear the floats. So you will remember that we used float left on the list items. So let's go ahead and clear those floats so that our layout still works. At the bottom of our style sheet, I'm going to paste in the de facto clearfix code. So now I can add a class of group to this unordered list element, and our layout is back to normal. So to review with SASS so far, we've seen variables, we just looked at nesting. We're going to transition into a new feature now named inheritance. In order to see inheritance in action, let's give ourselves a quick goal. On our example page, we have these two links that read learn more and alternate button. Now in our HTML, we can see that these are just links with a class of button A and button B. So let's write CSS so that they actually look like buttons. So first we'll begin with the button A class. So in our style sheet, I'll create a new rule and target button A. Now instead of having you watch me put together declarations for a button style, I'm just going to paste it in to save us a bit of time. So the only interesting part of this code is that I'm using the beautiful hue variable for the color of the border. So if we save and refresh in the browser, you can see that the first link looks like a button now. Now let's focus on the alternate button, or the element with a class of button B. Let's imagine that we want it to look identical to the button A class, except we want it to have a unique background color. So in our style sheet, let's create a new rule for button B. Now I know that I'm going to need all of these properties from button A. The only thing that I want to change is the background color. So to leverage all of these styles, I can simply type within the rule for button B, @ extend button A. New line, background color. Let's try black. So if I save and refresh in the browser, we see that button B is now styled. Now let's dissect what's going on. We were able to create that new button style in only 2 lines of code. Now there is no extend ability in normal CSS. So this is a SASS feature. SASS lets us type @ extend and then the name of a rule that we want to inherit the properties from. Now let's take a quick look at what the SASS compiler is doing behind the scenes. The rule for button B is simple enough, but if we look up here, the original rule for button A, we can see that the SASS compiler added a comma and then tacked on button B. So this isn't rocket science. We could do this on our own manually. But in terms of coding paradigms, it feels much more natural and enjoyable to keep things self-contained and modular. So instead of micromanaging our selectors, we can create neat, organized, self-contained rules for specific classes. We can also leverage the inheritance extendability to create cleaner HTML. So you will remember that we added a class of group to add the clearfix functionality for our top navigation. But what if we didn't want to add presentational classes to our HTML? What if we wanted to keep our HTML squeaky clean? So if I delete this class from the unordered list, we can see that our floats are not being cleared and the layout breaks. But we can use extend or inheritance on that unordered list. So I can simply type extend group. We know that the clearfix properties live within the group class. So if I save and refresh, the floats have been cleared. So in terms of how we relate conceptually to our content, for our unordered list, all we had to say was extend or inherit the clearfix properties and abilities of the group class. And then behind the scenes, the SASS compiler adjusted the selectors for the group clearfix class and added in site header nav unordered list in all of the right places. Let's take a quick time out to review what we've learned so far. We've looked at SASS variables. We've reviewed SASS nesting. We saw SASS inheritance in action. Now I want to talk about SASS's ability to break our code into smaller, neatly organized files. So for example, let's imagine that we want our style sheet to be incredibly organized. So what if we wanted any CSS code relating to our header to live in its own file? SASS makes this very simple. So I'm going to cut all of the header related code and I'm going to create a new file in our CSS folder. I'll paste in the code and I'll name this new file _ header.scss. Now back in our full style sheet where that code used to live, I can simply say import space single quotes header : and when I save, we will see literally no change in the CSS that the compiler outputs. The compiler simply goes in, grabs the code from the header file, and includes it right where we told it to. This is incredibly useful because as developers, it lets us stay organized, but the web browser still receives a single CSS file, so page load speeds remain quick. Now this lesson is almost complete. We will cover more advanced topics like operators and mix-ins in our next lesson. But before we end this lesson, I want to show you one final example of why SASS is amazing. Let's imagine that we decide button B should not use a black background, but instead should use a very light orange shade of our baseline orange color. Now instead of using color picking software, I'm going to show you an amazing feature that SASS offers. I'm going to use a function named lighten, and I'm going to pass it two values. The first value will be our baseline orange color that we saved in the beautiful hue variable. And the second value that I will pass it is how much lighter I want the color to become. So let's try 30%. So if we refresh, that's not quite light enough. Let's try 45%. Perfect. So behind the scenes, the SASS compiler calculated the exact hexadecimal color code that would be 45% lighter than our base orange color. SASS offers all sorts of magical functions like this. So now that our style sheet uses dynamic colors that are derived from a baseline color, if we ever decide that our web page should not use orange as its main color, but instead blue, it's as simple as jumping to a color picker, choosing the exact shade of blue that we want, updating our beautiful hue variable at the top of our style sheet with the new blue value, and when we save and refresh, we see that in one foul swoop, everything is updated, and we see that this button even has a nice blue shade that is 45% lighter than the baseline blue. Now that's going to bring this lesson to a close. We will cover more advanced SASS topics in our next lesson. Have fun, and I will see you shortly.